Romans is one of those books that can really easily become just a kind of a empty theological exercise. And we've been going through it now for 28 weeks. And I hope that each person in some way has found some measure of application for your life with regard to this. It is deeply theological, but there are applications here to be found that are very profound for you and for me. There's a lot of depth here. So let's try to plumb those depths today. I'll begin reading in chapter 11, verse 1. I say then, has God cast away His people? Certainly not. For I also am an Israelite, from the family of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God hasn't cast away His people whom He foreknew. Don't you know what the Scripture says of Elijah, how he pleads with God against Israel, saying, Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what does the divine response say to Elijah? I have reserved for myself 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Even so then at this present time there is a remnant according to the election of grace, and if by grace it is no longer of works. Otherwise grace is no longer grace. But if it is of works, it isn't grace any longer. Otherwise work is no longer work. So what then? Israel has not obtained what it seeks, but the elect have obtained it, and the rest were blinded. Just as it is written, God has given them a spirit of a stupor, eyes that they should not see, and ears that they should not hear, to this very day. And David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a recompense to them. Let their eyes be darkened so that they do not see, and bow their backs always. I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? Certainly not, but through their fall, to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles. If their fall is riches for the world, and their failure is riches for the Gentiles, how much more will be their fullness? Now, he asks the same question that he's asked now for several chapters and in several passages. Has God set aside the Jews? And the answer is no. And Paul says he makes an application here with regard to the Old Testament many times throughout this passage, but one very specifically. He says, wait a minute, there's a remnant. Speaking of the Old Testament, you go through the prophets and the Torah, and you find many times where this idea of the remnant appears. What is the remnant? Paul says, look at me. I'm a Jew, and I've believed. There is a remnant of belief still here, just as there always has been. He goes back and talks about Elijah. Elijah came to the place where he despaired. You remember that? I've always wondered about that text. How in the world? You watched God eat up the altar and wipe out 450 of the prophets of Baal right in front of you, and then you flee for your life because you're afraid of Jezebel. I'm thinking, wow, I wish God would do something like that where I could see it happen. I think I'd be pretty brave after that, wouldn't you? But there's Elijah, and he says, what in the world's going on, Lord? And God reminds him, there is a remnant in Israel of people who have believed. So what is the purpose of this idea of the remnant for you and for me? Well, it's to teach us something. And what it teaches you and me is, and don't ever forget this, if you don't remember much else, that's okay. But don't forget this, there never has been since the garden, there isn't now, and there will never be a time until Jesus returns that all will believe. That's just the way it is. I know in many Wednesday night discussions we talk about the fact that in this country, we look at our country and we see it going on the moral greasy skids as it just slides toward Gomorrah, as Robert Bork said. And yet, don't forget, here we are. We believe. We're the remnant. So that's what this idea carries with it. This idea that there are going to be those who will remain, who do follow. So if this is true, then has God decided to prevent the Jews from believing? Is He going to blind them as He does with Pharaoh? No, He's not. There is a legal recompense. If you read the text once again, you see He makes that case in verses 7 through 10, that if, and this is where it becomes personal for us, if you and I and the Jews or anybody come to the place wherein we continually say to God, no, over time something will happen. Paul uses a word here, porosis. It is the Greek word that means callous. And he speaks to you and to me and to the Jews and says, if we continue to reject God, there is something that will happen. We will become calloused over time. Jesus says the same thing. And the callous in Matthew 13, where he talks about the fact that to them that have been given, what was given to this one will be taken away and given to another. For those of us who believe, if we find ourselves calloused in our hearts, God will begin to allow that callous to grow to the place that whatever we might have had will be withdrawn from us. Think of the consequences of that for those who don't believe as time goes on. Paul, the same author to this group in Rome, says to Timothy in Ephesus, their hearts are seared as with a branding iron. Over time, it becomes more difficult for people to accept things from God. And this is where it touches us today, and this is where I want to make the application for you and for me. We come into a gathering, wherever that is, here today or wherever else we might be, and we like things about it. We like the fellowship. We like perhaps the chocolate cookies at the back, or the coffee, or the friendships we have in this room. We like all of that. And maybe in the gathering, hopefully in the gathering, the Word of God is opened up in some way. We like that. We like the feelings that we get as we have this time together. Sometimes. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes the feelings we get from the gathering are difficult because we get challenged in some way we didn't expect. If we find ourselves coming to this gathering and we're challenged, and the feelings we have aren't good ones, what happens to some of us? Sometimes we start to reserve our hearts and draw back over time. I want to ask us a question as we go through this today. Can you and I say honestly, think about this very hard. Can I honestly say there is no portion of my heart, no portion of who Rip Snow is or you are, that we don't hold back from God? Can we honestly say that? Is there not something in us that we say, I like all of these things when you tinker about my life in these ways, but I don't like it when you tinker here? Now think very hard about that. I'm going to point out one example, and this is, I could have chosen a dozen of them. I take this example because it speaks to the text. In the evangelical community, and this is very common. As soon as I say it, everybody's going to say, oh, I know what he's talking about. Within the evangelical community, we have, just as Paul speaks here, a certain assessment of the Jewish nation. All of us do. And that assessment sometimes is not a good one. How many of you have heard the jokes or used the phrases yourselves and myself wherein we talk about bargaining over a price with somebody and the Jewish name comes up? Now, that says something, but this is the question. I don't want anybody, please don't feel bad. I'm not accusing anybody of anything, I promise, because it's all of us. How is it that we might be comfortable with something like that? How is that? I'm going to say it's because there are places in my life, places in yours, where we are blinded and we are calloused and we don't even realize it. Some of the nicest, humblest, most seemingly on fire believers you will ever meet have calluses on their hearts that they aren't aware of. Maybe they don't want them there. I would say probably. Maybe they've grown so comfortable with them they don't want them removed. That happens too. Remember Peter? I'll die for you. Right? He found out that there was a part of his heart that he wasn't even aware of. Jesus brought it right out. And what happened? He did exactly what Peter said he would never do. Some people are damaged. Some people have been hurt in some way that is so deep that they cannot let go of the calluses that their hearts have. All of us, I would say all of us, if we're willing to admit it, have places in our lives where God is trying, He's picking at that thing, but we cannot let go of it. Some of us are choosing them to keep them because it's just more comfortable to stay right where we are. I can't answer that for anybody. Some of us want to have our hearts broken. We would say that. I bet you if I went around this room, or if Jesus came in, he's here, you know. If he were to come in and just say, hey, you or me, do you really want to be like this? And he showed us a picture of whatever it is in our hearts that we really needed to let go of. We'd say, oh man, take it away. I'm ready for it to go. But some of us want to feel strong in ourselves. And we don't want our hearts broken because of what it might look like. I think the perception of how God is going to work, or how we might like Him to work, says a lot about where our hearts are in this question. When we hear a sermon like this, God might confront us with the very thing that makes us hard of heart. He does. I think He does. I think He gives us chances all the time. Just as Tammy taught in Sunday school today, we're walking around in an encounter with God 24/7 if we're willing to receive it. And will we recognize the hard place for what it is? Many times I don't think we will. But we hear this kind of teaching, this kind of sermon, and we always categorize it as a carrot or a stick. Either God is going to draw us or He's going to whack us, punish us. That's how we see it. But it is neither. It is this text and texts like it, if we're willing, are God pleading, just as it said last week, He pled with His people with open arms for them to come, and they would not come. He pleads with you and me constantly for us to come and to be changed and healed of the things that cause calluses on our hearts. He's begging us. That's what this text is. It's not a carrot. It's not a stick. It's God saying, please, I want to make you better. I want to make you who I meant you to be. Just as in the completion of the Jews, you and I can be complete as well, if we're willing. But it's a hard road for some of us because the calluses are so deep and so hard. Think of it this way. Let me give you an example. We talked about it in Sunday school. I was so shocked. I thought, oh man, here we go again. Just ruin the sermon for me here. I look forward to these little moments and it gets brought up. And then I just got to live with it, and try to scramble around and figure out how I'm going to make that fit again. Think of a person. I bet you everybody in this room who is an adult or maybe even a kid has a person in their life who, if they were in here and people walked in and did not recognize them, that person would be offended. Can you think of somebody like that you've known or know, or maybe it's us, I don't know, I don't want to say that, but maybe we're like that, that somebody would come into this room and this person A is sitting there and person B, C, D, and E, and F, and on down the line go past them, and maybe person F doesn't say, hey, person A, how are you today? They don't do it, and person A is offended. That is a person with a calloused heart. That's a calloused heart. To hold something like that over somebody else and to not grant them the same mercy, as Tammy said today so eloquently, that you and I have been granted. To hold that over them. To punish them, if it's possible, for the fact that they've offended us. I'll tell you, anger, hatred, resentment, feeling slighted can be very, very deep. And so deep that you and I can't see it for ourselves. We're not able. That's where this is so good. Somebody is going to be a tool. That person that comes in the room, person F, comes in the room, doesn't see person A. Person F is consumed with whatever is on their heart that troubles them. They're not trying to be mean, but person A is offended. Person F is God's pry bar. That's the tool God's going to use if person A is willing to be pried open. If they're willing to have their heart broken, God will use people, even in a hurtful way, to change us into the people we're supposed to be. And I'll tell you, it's a better way to live. It's a better way to live. Pain can be a great lever in God's hand to pry a heart open. if we're willing to have our hearts pried open. Are we willing today to have it? Let me give you calluses on our hearts. I'm going to quote somebody here that you may not have ever heard of, but it's a pretty wise saying so. But calluses on our hearts always will make us think more about ourselves than we think about others. And we don't even know it. We don't even know it. Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk, great writer, he says this: the truth that many people never understand until it's too late, is that the more we try to avoid the suffering of change, the more we suffer. Because smaller and more insignificant things begin to torture us in proportion to our fear of being changed. Is that not true? Is that not true? The more we disallow God to open us up, we just say, no, Lord, not here, the more petty, immature, and childish we will become. And over time, a callous will form. And even the voice of God himself can't cut through it unless a miracle happens. I can't speak for anybody but Rip. I don't want to be like that, do you? I don't want to be like that. I want to be soft, such that when God breaks my heart, it's okay. It's okay. This is a good day to see God work. And God can take this gathering today, perhaps a prayer time, perhaps your reflections on today, whatever. And he can use these things to set us free from the ropes that entangle all of us. He can. Do we want to be free? Some of us do, some of us don't, some of us aren't sure, and some of us aren't able. But he'll use each of us in each other's lives if we'll allow it. So I'd say let's let today be that first step for all of us, wherein God pries open the door of our heart and opens us up to probe those hidden places. What entanglement would we have in our lives? Maybe we don't even know what it is. What entanglement would we ask God to set us free from today? I don't know where everybody is, but if there's a question about the sermon today, you want to speak with me, I'll